Hello, Father Alexander here. Welcome to St. Peter's in Hove and welcome to the Book of Numbers. I think this is our 39th step in our walking tour through the Bible. If you've made it this far, well done. Keep up the good work is all I'd say. The Book of Numbers, like the Book of Leviticus, does not enjoy a good reputation. It is very hard to read. And of course, the word book is a little bit misleading because the Book of Numbers is actually a compilation from various sources, things that have been put together, which don't actually have much unity. So there's no unity of narrative and there's no unity of tone. There are some things in the Book of Numbers, which we'll get onto, which are completely different from the other sort of things. It starts off with a record of the numbers of the Israelites, and who were given a very exact number, over 600,000 of them, as they march through the desert in their serried ranks, highly organized. Now, this is chapters 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 3 and chapter 4. And it's the first 4 chapters is giving us a survey of all the people who left Egypt, all the various clans, all the heads of the clans and so on, and how many they came to in numbers. It actually gives us the exact figure, down to the last unit. People have said, haven't they, that it can't possibly have been the case that 600,000 plus people, men, plus women and children, marched through the desert. The desert would not have been able to sustain that amount of people. For example, nowadays, when you consider the wars in the Middle East, fighting in the Sinai desert has been very difficult to do because the Egyptians and the Israelis found it very hard to supply their armies over those distances where there were no supplies. And that was one of the reasons why in 1950s the Sinai War, the Suez War and so on and other wars were all over very quickly because you can't maintain an army in the middle of nowhere. Armies need supplies, they need doctors, they need food, and above all, they need water. So probably this not very interesting list of all the clans of Israel is a list of the clans of Israel at the time of the writing of the Book of Numbers, let's say when Israel was a settled nation. And it's showing us, as I've said before, a retrojection, looking back and seeing how the people now present were then present, if you like, in their ancestors in the desert. So that's the first 4 chapters. Then we go on to various laws about clean and unclean and about Nazirites. Obviously, these were very, very important to our Jewish brethren at the time, and how to bless people. And then, of course, we have a bit about dedication offerings and so on, certain liturgical laws, which are not particularly interesting. And that goes on until chapter 9, when they depart, and how they depart, and the order in which they depart. One of the things we do find in chapter 9, verse 15, is something extremely interesting. We've talked about the dwelling, the tabernacle, and there's more about that in Numbers. And it says, 9:15, on the day the dwelling was erected, the cloud covered the dwelling, the tent of the testimony. From nightfall until morning, it remained over the dwelling, looking like fire. So the cloud covered it all the time, and at night it looked like fire. This is interesting. The cloud is the presence of God. By night it's fire, by day it's a cloud. And then it goes on, whenever the cloud rose from the tent, the Israelites broke camp, and wherever the cloud halted, there the Israelites pitched camp. At the Lord's order, the Israelites set out, and at the Lord's order, the Israelites pitched camp. Well, it repeats what it's just said, so it shows it's important. They remained in camp as long as the cloud rested on the dwelling, repeats it yet again. If the cloud stayed for many days on the dwelling, the Israelites performed their duty to the Lord and did not set out. But if the cloud happened to stay only for a few days on the dwelling, just as they had pitched camp at the Lord's order they set out. If the cloud happened to remain only from evening till morning, they set out when it lifted the next morning. Or if it stayed for a whole day and night, they set out only when it was lifted. Well, you get the idea. In other words, sometimes it says they stayed there for 2 days, a month, or a longer time. However long the cloud rested on the dwelling, the Israelites remained in camp. So the Israelites are nomads, but the nomads are led by the cloud, by the presence of God. Now, this is extremely important. The Israelites are the community of Israel, or as they're sometimes called, it depends on which translation you're using, they're called the community or the congregation. Now, a community or a congregation only exists if it has somebody who calls it to be a community or to be a congregation. People congregate around God. People come into a community, become one, unity, because somebody has called them to be a community, in this case, God. So the presence of the cloud is the raison d'etre of Israel. Without the cloud, then they'd all go their separate ways. But God is in their midst, and therefore they are one. Now, this is extremely important for us. God is in our midst. Jesus Christ has promised us this, and therefore we are called to be one. We're called to be the community of the church. The moment we stop following the cloud, we take our minds off the presence of God in our midst, then we cease to be the church. And that passage I've just read, which is incredibly, it's only saying one thing, but it says the one thing again and again and again. Well, clearly, the author of the book of Numbers, or this part of it, is wanting to make the same point I make. It is the principle of unity in the church is the dwelling of the Holy Spirit in our midst, or it is the presence of God in the tabernacle, the dwelling, the tent, the tabernacle. Then, if we could just look along to chapter 11, the rabble who had joined the people were feeling the pangs of hunger. Now, we go back here to what we had in Exodus, people complaining about nothing to eat. But we have a very important word, the rabble. And it could immediately, this is 11:4. In other words, the rabble. Rabble is, it's not really a word you use in everyday English. In French, it's racaille. It's very, very, very insulting to use that word in French. It means it means basically the scum of the earth. I remember once the president of France, I think it was Mr. Sarkozy, used this of some rioters, and everybody was very, very shocked. It means a sans-culotte. It means the people who are at the dregs of society. Well, okay, the rabble who had joined the people. So what's this? Now, we were told in Exodus that some people had joined them after they left Egypt. Well, this was the alien elements among them, but there's no alien elements among them. They've all eating the Passover and they're all following the Jewish law. And then these rabble who had joined them start complaining about how much they had to eat in Egypt. Well, obviously, that contradicts it. They can't have joined them after Egypt because in that case, they wouldn't have remembered what they had to eat in Egypt. The important thing to remember here, and this is a very important point, in my humble opinion, the people of Israel, the community of Israel, the congregation of Israel, at the same time as a rabble. Now, a rabble is a mob. It's a people who have nothing in common. It's a crowd. Crowds are threatening. Crowds are not nice. Sometimes we say, oh, I went to Oxford Street and the crowds were terrible. In other words, there were just too many people around. But sometimes crowds can be extremely violent, extremely threatening, extremely destructive. So crowds are never good, but crowds can be very, very nasty. And so what you see here as the Israelites make their way through the desert is a transformation from rabble, crowd, to congregation and community. God is calling them to leave one set of presumptions behind, we're a rabble, we're a crowd, and to embrace another set of assumptions, we are a community called together by God. Okay, all the best. We'll talk about numbers again. Bye.